June 1st, 1946. A former dictator sits in a cramped prison cell in Bucharest, knowing that his final dawn is breaking. Ion Antonescu, the man who once commanded armies and shaped the fate of nations, now counts his remaining hours in single digits. Just 5 years earlier, this same man had stood beside Adolf Hitler, controlling the destiny of Romania and the lives of millions. He had sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers to die on frozen battlefields and authorized policies that would forever stain his nation's history. But now, the tables had turned completely. The man who had once held absolute power faced his final reckoning. What thoughts consumed his mind in those last hours? How did a decorated military officer transform into one of Europe's most notorious wartime leaders? And what exactly happened during those final, desperate moments before his execution? The answers lie in a story of ambition, betrayal, and ultimate justice that would close one of the darkest chapters in Romanian history. To understand Ion Antonescu's final hours, we must first examine how a career military officer became known as conducătorul, the leader of Romania. His path to absolute power was paved with political cunning, military expertise, and a fatal alliance that would ultimately seal his doom. Born in 1882 in the small town of Petești, Antonescu showed early promise as a military strategist and fierce nationalist. His rise through the Romanian military ranks during World War I earned him recognition as one of the country's most capable officers. By the 1930s, he had become a prominent figure in Romanian politics, known for his authoritarian views and unwavering belief in military discipline. Romania in the late 1930s was a nation caught between competing powers. The country faced territorial pressures from the Soviet Union, Hungary, and Bulgaria, while trying to maintain its independence in an increasingly dangerous European landscape. King Carol II struggled to navigate these treacherous waters, but his controversial personal life and political mistakes had weakened the monarchy's position significantly. The political crisis reached a boiling point in September 1940, when the Iron Guard, Romania's fascist movement, began gaining dangerous momentum. King Carol II, desperate to maintain stability, made a fateful decision that would change Romanian history forever. He appointed Ion Antonescu as prime minister, believing the general's strong personality could control the volatile political situation. But Antonescu had different plans entirely. Within days of his appointment, he demanded that King Carol II abdicate in favor of his young son, Michael. The king, realizing he had no choice, fled the country with his controversial mistress, leaving Romania in Antonescu's hands. The general had successfully executed a bloodless coup that transformed him from military advisor to absolute dictator. Antonescu's first major decision as Romania's leader would prove to be his most consequential. Faced with growing pressure from Nazi Germany and the threat of Soviet expansion, he chose to align Romania firmly with Hitler's regime. In November 1940, Romania officially joined the Axis powers, a decision that brought immediate military support, but would ultimately lead to national catastrophe. The new dictator restructured Romanian society according to his vision of military efficiency and nationalist ideology. He disbanded political parties, censored the press, and established a police state that eliminated political opposition through imprisonment and intimidation. Citizens who had once enjoyed democratic freedoms found themselves living under an increasingly repressive regime that brooked no dissent. Antonescu's alliance with Nazi Germany went beyond mere military cooperation. He embraced many aspects of Nazi ideology, including anti-Semitic policies that would have devastating consequences for Romania's Jewish population. Laws restricting Jewish rights, confiscating property, and excluding Jews from public life were implemented with ruthless efficiency. The dictator's military background shaped his approach to governance. He ran Romania like a military operation, with rigid hierarchies, absolute obedience, and swift punishment for those who failed to comply with his directives. This militaristic approach initially brought some stability to a country that had been plagued by political chaos, but it came at an enormous cost in human freedom and dignity. By 1941, Antonescu had consolidated his power completely. He controlled the army, the police, the government, and the press. Opposition voices had been silenced, and potential rivals had been eliminated or co-opted. The man who had once served the Romanian state now personified it entirely. But this absolute power would soon lead Antonescu into decisions that would cost hundreds of thousands of lives and ultimately bring about his own destruction. Antonescu's partnership with Adolf Hitler transformed from political necessity into active collaboration in some of the war's most devastating campaigns. This alliance would provide the evidence that would ultimately condemn him to death. The relationship between the two dictators began with mutual respect and shared strategic interests. Hitler needed Romania's oil resources and geographic position to secure his eastern flank, while Antonescu sought German protection against Soviet threats and hoped to regain territories lost in previous wars. Their first meeting in November 1940 established a partnership that would prove catastrophic for both nations. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union in June 1941, Antonescu committed Romania wholeheartedly to the campaign. Romanian forces, numbering over 600,000 men, joined German armies in the invasion of the Soviet Union. This was not a reluctant alliance, but an enthusiastic partnership that Antonescu believed would restore Romanian greatness. The Romanian dictator's motivations went beyond mere military cooperation. He harbored deep resentment over the Soviet occupation of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina in 1940, territories he was determined to reclaim. The war against the Soviet Union offered an opportunity for territorial recovery and revenge against what he viewed as Bolshevik aggression. Romanian forces participated in some of the war's bloodiest campaigns. They fought alongside German units in the siege of Odessa, the battle for Sevastopol, and the advance toward Stalingrad. Romanian soldiers suffered enormous casualties in these campaigns, with entire divisions destroyed in desperate fighting that served German strategic objectives rather than Romanian national interests. The siege of Odessa in 1941 became particularly significant in establishing Antonescu's culpability for war crimes. Romanian forces, under his direct command, participated in actions against civilian populations that violated international law. The systematic targeting of Jewish communities during the occupation of Soviet territories created evidence that would later be used against him in court. Antonescu's anti-Semitic policies escalated dramatically during the war years. The deportation of Jews from recovered territories, the establishment of concentration camps on Romanian soil, and the systematic confiscation of Jewish property created a machinery of persecution that operated with deadly efficiency. These actions were not imposed by German pressure but reflected Antonescu's own ideological convictions. The dictator's regime also targeted other minority populations, including Roma communities and political dissidents. Concentration camps established in Transnistria became sites of mass suffering and death, with Romanian authorities directly responsible for the conditions that led to thousands of deaths. As the war progressed, the relationship between Antonescu and Hitler evolved from partnership to subordination. The Romanian leader found himself increasingly dependent on German support, while losing control over his country's destiny. German economic advisors took control of Romanian resources, while German military commanders made strategic decisions that affected Romanian territory. The turning point came with the disaster at Stalingrad in 1942-43, where Romanian forces suffered catastrophic losses. Entire armies were destroyed or captured, and the survivors returned home, demoralized and bitter about their sacrifice for German objectives. The Romanian public began to question their leader's wisdom in allying so closely with Nazi Germany. By 1943, it was becoming clear to many observers that Germany was losing the war. However, Antonescu remained committed to the alliance, partly out of ideological conviction and partly because he had no viable alternative. His regime had become so identified with Nazi Germany that changing sides seemed impossible without losing power entirely. The dictator's stubbornness in maintaining the German alliance, even as the military situation deteriorated, demonstrated the fatal flaw in his leadership. His inability to adapt to changing circumstances and his refusal to consider alternatives would ultimately prove to be his downfall. As Soviet forces began their westward advance in 1944, Antonescu faced increasing pressure from within Romania to change course. But his commitment to Hitler's cause had become so complete that he could not envision any other path forward. August 23, 1944, marked the end of Ion Antonescu's dictatorship in the most dramatic fashion possible. The events of this single day would transform Romania's wartime allegiance and seal the dictator's fate, though he would not fully comprehend the consequences until much later. King Michael I, who had remained largely powerless since his father's abdication, had been quietly planning with opposition, politicians, and military officers who recognized that Romania's alliance with Germany was leading the country toward total destruction. Soviet forces were advancing rapidly through Romania, and it was clear that continued resistance would result in the complete occupation and devastation of the country. The young king's conspirators included prominent politicians from banned democratic parties, military officers who had grown disillusioned with the German alliance, and civilians who recognized that Romania needed to change sides immediately to avoid complete catastrophe. Their planning had been meticulous, taking months to organize while maintaining absolute secrecy from Antonescu's security apparatus. On that fateful August morning, King Michael summoned Antonescu to Bucharest Palace for what the dictator believed would be a routine meeting about the worsening military situation. Antonescu arrived at the palace with his usual confidence, unaware that his opponents had been preparing for this moment for months. The meeting began normally, with discussions about the Soviet advance and Romania's military options. However, the king soon made it clear that he was demanding Romania's immediate withdrawal from the Axis alliance and the beginning of negotiations with the Allied powers. Antonescu, shocked by this unexpected challenge to his authority, refused categorically to consider changing Romania's allegiance to Germany. What followed was a confrontation that would determine Romania's fate for the remainder of the war. The dictator, accustomed to absolute obedience, could not comprehend that his authority was being challenged so directly. He threatened the king with dire consequences and insisted that Romania's destiny remain tied to German victory. King Michael, despite his youth, demonstrated remarkable courage in this crucial moment. He formally dismissed Antonescu from all his positions and declared that Romania would immediately cease hostilities against the Allied forces. When Antonescu refused to acknowledge his dismissal, palace guards arrested the stunned dictator on the king's direct orders. The speed of subsequent events revealed how thoroughly the conspirators had planned their operation. Within hours of Antonescu's arrest, new government officials were announcing Romania's switch to the Allied side. Romanian forces received orders to cease fighting against Soviet troops and to begin cooperating with the advancing Red Army. Antonescu's initial reaction was one of complete disbelief. He had wielded absolute power for nearly 4 years, and could not accept that his authority could be terminated so abruptly. From his initial detention, he demanded to be released and threatened severe consequences for those who had dared to challenge his leadership. The German response was swift and violent. Hitler, enraged by what he viewed as Romanian treachery, ordered immediate bombing attacks on Bucharest and other Romanian cities. German forces attempted to regain control of strategic positions, but Romanian troops, following their new orders, resisted German efforts and began cooperating with Soviet forces. Within days, it became clear that the coup had succeeded completely. German forces were either retreating or being captured. Soviet troops were being welcomed as liberators rather than conquerors, and Romania's transition to the Allied side was proceeding rapidly. The war that had cost Romania hundreds of thousands of casualties was effectively over. For Antonescu, however, this dramatic reversal meant that he had instantly transformed from a powerful dictator into a war criminal awaiting judgment. His former allies were now his enemies, and his former enemies held his life in their hands. The man who had once commanded armies now faced an uncertain future as a prisoner. The psychological impact of this sudden reversal was devastating for Antonescu. Years later, those who observed him during his imprisonment would note that he never fully accepted the legitimacy of his overthrow. He maintained that he had been betrayed by ungrateful subordinates and continued to believe in the righteousness of his alliance with Germany. But the political and military consequences of the August 23rd coup extended far beyond Antonescu's personal fate. Romania's switch to the Allied side shortened the war in Europe by several months and saved countless lives that would have been lost in continued fighting. The transformation from absolute dictator to imprisoned war criminal was perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of Antonescu's downfall. The man who had once controlled every aspect of Romanian life now found himself subject to the whims of his captors and the changing political landscape of post-war Europe. Initially, Antonescu was held under relatively comfortable conditions by King Michael's government. which was careful to treat the former dictator according to international standards for high-ranking prisoners. He was confined in secure quarters but allowed books, writing materials, and regular meals. However, this period of relative comfort ended abruptly with the arrival of Soviet forces in Bucharest. Stalin's government viewed the former Romanian leader as a major war criminal, who deserved no special consideration. The transfer to Soviet custody marked a dramatic deterioration in his living conditions. Soviet authorities moved him to Moscow, where he was held in the notorious Lubyanka prison, alongside other high-ranking war criminals. The comfortable quarters he had enjoyed in Romanian custody were replaced by harsh prison conditions designed to break the spirit of even the strongest individuals. During his time in Soviet custody, Antonescu underwent intensive interrogation sessions that lasted for months. Soviet intelligence officers were determined to extract every detail about Romania's wartime activities, particularly those involving actions against Soviet citizens and territory. These exhausting sessions were designed to prepare the comprehensive case that would be presented at his eventual trial. The former dictator's mental state during this period showed signs of significant deterioration. Those who observed him noted that he alternated between periods of defiant anger and deep depression. He maintained his belief in the righteousness of his actions, while struggling to comprehend how completely his world had changed. The psychological impact of prolonged imprisonment was evident in Antonescu's physical appearance when he was finally returned to Romania for trial in 1946. Observers noted that he had aged dramatically during his captivity and showed signs of the stress that had accompanied his fall from power. During his imprisonment, Antonescu used his time to prepare his defense, though he faced the challenge of justifying actions that had resulted in massive casualties and contributed to some of the war's worst atrocities. His defense strategy centered on claims that he had acted in Romania's national interest and had been forced into difficult decisions by circumstances beyond his control. As his trial date approached, Antonescu's situation became increasingly desperate. The evidence against him was overwhelming. International support for leniency was non-existent, and the new Romanian government needed to demonstrate its commitment to justice for wartime crimes. The trial of Ion Antonescu began on May 6, 1946, in Bucharest, representing one of the most significant war crimes proceedings in Eastern European history. The Romanian People's Tribunal had assembled a comprehensive case that would expose the full extent of his regime's actions. The prosecution's case was built on three main charges: crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Hundreds of documents, witness testimonies, and evidence of systematic atrocities committed under his regime formed an overwhelming body of proof against the former dictator. Antonescu appeared in court, wearing his old military uniform, a deliberate choice that reflected his continued belief in the legitimacy of his wartime leadership. Despite months of imprisonment, he maintained a dignified bearing and showed no signs of remorse for his actions. His demeanor suggested a man who remained convinced of his own righteousness. The prosecution presented evidence of Antonescu's direct involvement in planning and executing policies that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. Documents recovered from government archives showed his personal authorization of deportations, executions, and other measures that violated international law. His signatures appeared on orders that had condemned entire communities to death or displacement. One of the most damaging pieces of evidence was Antonescu's extensive correspondence with German officials, which demonstrated his enthusiastic participation in Nazi policies rather than reluctant compliance under pressure. These documents showed that he had actively sought closer cooperation with Germany and had proposed measures that went beyond what German authorities had requested. The testimony of survivors and witnesses provided devastating personal accounts of the suffering caused by Antonescu's policies. Jewish survivors described the deportations, the concentration camps, and the systematic destruction of their communities. Romanian soldiers testified about being sent to die in campaigns that served German rather than Romanian interests. Antonescu's defense strategy attempted to portray him as a patriot who had made difficult decisions under impossible circumstances. His lawyers argued that he had acted to protect Romanian independence and that his alliance with Germany had been necessary to prevent Soviet occupation. They claimed that he had been unaware of the full extent of atrocities committed by subordinates. However, the documentary evidence made it clear that Antonescu had been directly involved in policy decisions and had been fully informed about their consequences. His personal involvement in planning operations and his detailed correspondence with subordinates demonstrated his direct responsibility for the regime's crimes. The trial proceedings revealed the systematic nature of the atrocities committed under Antonescu's leadership. Evidence showed that the persecution of minorities, the mistreatment of prisoners of war, and the exploitation of occupied territories had been official policies rather than isolated incidents. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the evidence against Antonescu was overwhelming and that his conviction was virtually certain. The only remaining question was whether he would receive the death sentence or life imprisonment. The prosecution's closing arguments emphasized that his crimes warranted the ultimate penalty given their scale and systematic planning. On May 17, 1946, after 11 days of testimony and deliberation, the tribunal prepared to deliver its verdict. The moment of judgment arrived with all the gravity befitting one of Europe's most significant war crimes trials. Judge Alexandru Voitinovici delivered the verdict with solemn formality. The tribunal found Ion Antonescu guilty on all counts: crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The death sentence was pronounced with the weight of hundreds of thousands of victims behind it. Antonescu listened to his condemnation with apparent composure, though observers noted that his hands trembled slightly as the judge spoke. The man who had once held the power of life and death over millions now faced his own execution. Antonescu's immediate response was to maintain his innocence and declare that history would vindicate his actions. He told the court that he had acted as a patriot and that his decisions had been necessary for Romania's survival. His final statement showed no acknowledgement of the suffering caused by his regime and no remorse for the consequences of his choices. Following the verdict, Antonescu's legal team immediately filed appeals to higher authorities, though their options were extremely limited under the post-war Romanian legal system. They petitioned King Michael for clemency, arguing that execution would be excessive punishment even for serious crimes. They also appealed to international organizations, seeking intervention to prevent the death sentence from being carried out. During the appeals period, Antonescu was held under maximum security conditions in Bucharest's Gilava prison. His cell was monitored constantly, and he was allowed minimal contact with the outside world. Prison officials took extraordinary precautions to prevent any escape attempts or attacks by vengeful former victims. The former dictator used this period to write extensively, producing memoirs and letters that attempted to justify his actions and explain his version of events. These writings revealed a man who remained convinced of his own righteousness and who blamed others for Romania's wartime disasters. Family members were allowed limited visits during the appeals process, creating emotionally charged scenes that were carefully monitored by prison authorities. Antonescu's wife and other relatives pleaded with him to show remorse, believing this might improve his chances for clemency. However, he remained defiant and refused to acknowledge wrongdoing. International diplomatic efforts to intervene in the case were minimal and unsuccessful. While some Western governments privately expressed concerns about the judicial process, none were willing to advocate publicly for a man whose crimes had been so thoroughly documented. The political climate of 1946 offered no sympathy for unrepentant Nazi allies. The appeals were systematically rejected by higher courts, each decision confirming both the verdict and the death sentence. King Michael, despite personal appeals from Antonescu's family, declined to grant clemency. The young monarch was not willing to spare the life of the man whose policies had brought such disaster to Romania. As the final appeal was rejected in late May 1946, it became clear that Antonescu would indeed face execution. Prison authorities began making preparations for the sentence to be carried out, while the condemned man spent his remaining days in solitary contemplation of his fate. With all legal avenues exhausted, the stage was set for the final act in the drama of Ion Antonescu's rise and fall. As June 1946 approached, Ion Antonescu began his final countdown in the cells of Gilava prison. The man who had once commanded a nation now faced the ultimate solitude, knowing that each sunrise brought him closer to his appointment with death. Prison records show that Antonescu maintained a strict daily routine, rising early and spending considerable time writing in notebooks provided by his guards. His writings during these final days focused heavily on defending his legacy and explaining his actions to future historians. He seemed more concerned with how history would remember him than with preparing spiritually for death. Dr. Constantin Angelescu, the prison physician who examined Antonescu during his final days, noted significant changes in the former dictator's physical condition. The stress of impending execution had accelerated his aging process, and he appeared to have lost considerable weight. Despite these physical changes, his mental faculties remained sharp. Family visits during this period were emotionally devastating for all involved. Antonescu's wife, Maria, was allowed several final meetings that were supervised closely by prison officials. These encounters were marked by tears and desperate pleas from family members who begged him to show remorse in hopes of securing last-minute clemency. Antonescu's responses remained consistent. He refused to apologize for actions he considered patriotic. The condemned dictator received regular visits from Orthodox priests who attempted to prepare him for his final moments. However, these spiritual counseling sessions revealed Antonescu's continued resistance to accepting responsibility for his wartime actions. He maintained his belief that he had served Romania honorably, and that his execution represented a miscarriage of justice. Letters from Antonescu during this period, carefully censored before being delivered, revealed his continued preoccupation with political justification rather than personal reflection. He wrote extensively about Romania's geopolitical situation during the war, and continued to argue that his alliance with Germany had been the only viable option for national survival. Medical staff reported that Antonescu's sleep patterns had become increasingly irregular as his execution date approached. He would often pace his cell during the night hours, apparently engaged in internal debates about his legacy and the justice of his fate. These behaviors suggested that despite his outward defiance, he was struggling internally with his situation. Prison officials implemented extraordinary security measures during Antonescu's final weeks. Guards were posted in rotating shifts to ensure constant surveillance, and all visitors were searched thoroughly. Authorities feared both escape attempts and possible attacks by individuals seeking personal revenge for wartime losses. As May gave way to June, prison authorities began making final preparations for the execution, while maintaining absolute secrecy about the exact timing. Antonescu was informed that his death was imminent, but was not given specific details about when it would be carried out. This uncertainty added another layer of psychological pressure to his final hours. June 1st, 1946, dawned gray and overcast in Bucharest, as if nature itself was marking the somber significance of the day. In his cell at Gilava prison, Ion Antonescu woke before dawn, as had become his habit during the final weeks of his life. Prison guards noted that he seemed calmer than he had been in recent days, perhaps finding some peace in the knowledge that his long wait was finally ending. Prison officials had made elaborate preparations for the execution, while maintaining strict secrecy about the timing. Only a small number of authorized personnel knew that this would be the day, and extraordinary measures had been taken to prevent information from leaking to the press or public. At approximately 8 a.m., the prison director, accompanied by Orthodox clergy and official witnesses, arrived at Antonescu's cell to inform him that his execution would take place within the hour. The condemned man received this news with apparent composure, though witnesses noted that his hands trembled slightly as he finished his breakfast. Antonescu's final meal was simple: bread, cheese, and coffee, which he consumed slowly while engaging in quiet conversation with the Orthodox priest, who had been counseling him during his final days. The religious official later noted that even at this final moment, the former dictator seemed more interested in justifying his political decisions than in preparing spiritually for death. The process of preparing Antonescu for execution followed established protocols designed to maintain dignity while ensuring security. He was allowed to write final letters to his family members, though these would be delivered only after his death. His final written words reportedly continued to maintain his innocence and to express hope that history would vindicate his actions. During his final hour, Antonescu was visited by the prison physician who confirmed his fitness for execution. The former dictator requested a final meeting with his spiritual advisor, during which he participated in Orthodox religious rites. However, witnesses noted that he did not make any confession of guilt or express remorse for his wartime actions. At approximately 9:30 a.m., Antonescu was informed that the time had come for his execution. He was given a few final moments to compose himself before being escorted from his cell by prison guards. Witnesses described his demeanor as resigned but dignified, maintaining his composure despite the gravity of his situation. The walk from his cell to the execution site was brief, but symbolically significant. The man who had once strode through government buildings as absolute ruler of Romania now walked the corridors of a prison as a condemned criminal. The contrast between his former power and current helplessness was stark and unmistakable. Antonescu's final words to prison officials reportedly focused on his continued belief that he had served Romania faithfully and that his execution represented injustice rather than legitimate punishment. He maintained this position even as guards prepared him for death, showing no acknowledgement of the suffering caused by his regime. As 10 a.m. approached, all preparations were complete. The man who had once held the fate of millions in his hands was about to face his own final judgment. At 10 a.m. on June 1st, 1946, Ion Antonescu walked to his execution with the same military bearing that had characterized his entire career. Prison guards escorted him to a small courtyard within Gilava prison, where a firing squad of 7 Romanian soldiers waited in formation. Official witnesses to the execution included the prison director, a military prosecutor, a medical officer, and a representative from the Ministry of Justice. Orthodox clergy were also present to provide final spiritual support, though Antonescu had declined the traditional blindfold and continued to maintain his innocence even as he faced the firing squad. The formal reading of the death sentence was brief and procedural. A military officer read the charges and conviction while Antonescu stood at attention, displaying the military discipline that had defined his life. Witnesses noted that he showed no visible signs of fear, though the slight trembling of his hands betrayed the enormous stress he was experiencing. When offered the opportunity to make final statements, Antonescu reportedly declared his continued belief in the righteousness of his actions and his service to Romania. His final words focused on his conviction that history would vindicate his wartime leadership, and that his execution represented political injustice rather than legitimate punishment for crimes. Prison officials followed established procedures for military execution, offering Antonescu the traditional cigarette and blindfold. He accepted the cigarette, but declined the blindfold, stating that he wished to face his death with open eyes. This decision was consistent with his maintained defiance and his refusal to acknowledge guilt for his wartime actions. The firing squad consisted of experienced military personnel who had been selected for their reliability and discretion. Their identities were kept secret to protect them from potential retaliation, and they had been instructed to aim for the heart to ensure a swift and humane death. At exactly 10:15 a.m., the order to fire was given. 7 rifles discharged simultaneously, and Ion Antonescu fell to the ground, killed instantly by multiple bullets to the chest. The prison physician immediately confirmed his death, officially ending the life of the man who had ruled Romania with absolute power during some of the most turbulent years in the nation's history. The execution was conducted with professional efficiency and without incident. Witnesses to the execution later described the event as somber but dignified, noting that Antonescu had faced death with the same composure he had shown throughout his trial and imprisonment. His refusal to show remorse or acknowledge guilt remained consistent even in these final moments. The death of Ion Antonescu marked the end of an era in Romanian history and represented one of the most significant war crimes punishments in Eastern Europe. His execution demonstrated that even the highest-ranking officials would be held accountable for their wartime actions, regardless of their former power or status. The death of Ion Antonescu sent shockwaves through Romania and across Europe, marking the definitive end of the country's wartime chapter and establishing important precedents for post-war justice. The execution of such a high-ranking former leader demonstrated that accountability would extend to the highest levels of wartime government. Romanian authorities handled the immediate aftermath with careful attention to both security and symbolic significance. Antonescu's body was buried in an unmarked grave within the prison grounds, a deliberate decision to prevent his burial site from becoming a rallying point for former supporters. The public announcement of Antonescu's execution was made through official government channels several hours after the event, allowing authorities to implement security measures designed to prevent potential civil unrest. Romanian police forces were placed on heightened alert throughout the country, though significant disturbances did not materialize. International reaction to the execution was generally supportive, with allied governments expressing satisfaction that justice had been served for wartime crimes. The execution was seen as an important step in Romania's transition from Axis ally to member of the post-war international community. Family members of Antonescu were deeply affected by his execution, though they were forced to grieve privately due to the political climate surrounding his case. His wife Maria faced ongoing scrutiny and social isolation, while other relatives found their lives permanently altered by their association with the executed dictator. Antonescu's execution established important precedents for war crimes prosecution that would influence international justice for decades to come. His case demonstrated that former heads of state and government could be held personally accountable for systematic atrocities committed under their leadership. The historical assessment of Antonescu's trial and execution has evolved significantly over the decades since 1946. Modern historians generally agree that he bore significant responsibility for wartime atrocities, though some debate continues about the fairness of the judicial proceedings and the political influences that may have affected his case. Modern Romania continues to grapple with the legacy of the Antonescu period, balancing historical accountability with efforts to understand the complex circumstances that led to his rise to power and ultimate downfall. The execution of Ion Antonescu represented both an ending and a beginning, the end of Romania's wartime dictatorship and the beginning of a long process of historical reckoning that continues to influence Romanian society decades later. The brutal last hours of Ion Antonescu serve as a powerful reminder of how quickly absolute power can crumble, and how justice, though sometimes delayed, can ultimately prevail. The man who had once stood alongside Hitler, commanding armies and determining the fate of millions, spent his final morning in a prison cell, facing the consequences of his wartime decisions. From his rise as a decorated military officer to his transformation into an authoritarian dictator, Antonescu's story illustrates the dangerous path from nationalism to extremism. His alliance with Nazi Germany, his persecution of minority populations, and his willingness to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of Romanian soldiers for German objectives created a legacy of suffering that demanded accountability. Antonescu faced his final hours with the same unrepentant defiance that had characterized his entire political career, maintaining his belief in his own righteousness, even as he walked to his execution. His refusal to acknowledge the massive human cost of his decisions provides a chilling example of how ideology can blind leaders to the consequences of their actions. The story of Ion Antonescu's last hours reminds us that history's judgment, while sometimes slow, is ultimately inescapable. Those who abuse power and cause massive human suffering will eventually face accountability, regardless of how untouchable they may seem at the height of their authority. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.